Thanks for listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. I'm Andrew Campbell, and with me today we've got Grace Jones, a territory manager with Corteva. Thanks for coming in, Grace.
For having me.
And Holly Loucas. It's been a while since you've been on the podcast. You're an area agronomist with Pioneer. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
And so you two are here today to talk. Enlist is obviously a subject we do talk about, but I think what today's episode is really about is how can we get the most from E3 beans? How do we make sure whatever the spray program looks like, we do it correctly so that we can take advantage of that yield potential? Because it is one of those things, as more and more growers flip to the E3 program, switch to Enlist beans, it can be new. And certainly, for me as a grower, I don't always love new. I like, what I'm comfortable with. But I think as we've heard before, there's lots of potential in some new varieties in the Enlist beans. So maybe, Grace, you're from kind of the very southwest part of Ontario. You've seen probably the most transition of anybody in Canada to the E3 program. Talk a little bit about experiences that you've seen from growers, in terms of some of the lessons they've learned over the last few years as they've switched from whatever trait they were on to the Enlist one.
So I cover the area that is London to Niagara Falls. So within that geography, there's a couple of more sensitive crop areas, specifically Norfolk County, a lot of horticulture down there. So many of the early adopters of the Enlist system were adopting for that cold XD technology because it gave them the opportunity to spray over a longer window of time, up to that R2 flowering window. Also, since there's no temperature restrictions, they wanted to be able to spray in July without those concerns of off-target movement. However, with that behavior happening, some of them maybe reverted away from their known ways that they should have started with a strong residual program up front and come back in post and decided, I'm going to wait and do my herbicide pass later because the Enlist system allows me to do so. So they'd come back, their weeds would be larger, they'd be harder to control. So at the end of the day, they were maybe having less than success because their weeds were 6 to 8 inches tall when they finally came back to get them. So it was almost as though the benefits of the flexibility of the Enlist system became a bit of a hindrance because they pushed it. So I would say big lessons being the people that took the best advantage of it is they found the right variety that worked for their farm, continued to utilize good herbicides up front, and utilize the Enlist herbicides as needed, whether that's in a burn down or as a later pass.
So then, Holly, in terms of, what if Mother Nature agrees with me all the time, what would be the most ideal program I could have for Enlist beans to make sure that, all those weeds are not going to, take away from any yield?
Yeah, so I think starting with a really solid residual program up front just sets you up to have good weed control for that period from when you plant to when the weeds are emerging. If you happen to get a rain during there and maybe that delays your second when you're coming in crop, it just kind of gives you that foundation weed control that then allows you the flexibility, whether if it's weather or maybe you're just busy with, other things during the season that, sometimes that delays your second in-crop or first in-crop application. It just gives you really good weed control and a longer window to control the weeds.
Because, Grace, in terms of critical weed-free period, I've heard lots of it in corn. I don't hear as much about it in soybeans. What is that?
So the critical weed-free period in soybeans would be that first trifoliate up to about that third trifoliate. So key factor being with right now, the main weed of concern being water hemp and fleabane that we're managing across my area is that you need to be, in order to control it effectively, you need to use herbicides that are registered pre-plant or pre-emerge. So you want to make sure you get those down. And then ideally, hopefully we're going to get a activating rain within a couple of weeks to get those herbicides working so that they can give you that residual control to hopefully get you later into season. Likely may need a second pass of a herbicide as needed. But main thing is understanding what your weed spectrum is so that you're staying clean between that first trifoliate and third trifoliate is ideal.
So then in terms of, that's kind of the run of some of those weeds you've really got to watch for in the south? Holly, you kind of cover a more northern area. It won't be quite the same weeds that you're looking to control. What are the ones that you think the Enlist program fits well to control?
Sure. So, we typically don't have as much Roundup Ready fleabane or water hemp yet. It's probably coming, but we kind of just have the standard, whether you're no-till or a tillage system, annuals, perennial weeds, that a Roundup 2,4-D program can clean up well. So there aren't too many specifics. It's a good program. The one thing we can use it for is things like volunteer canola, where we typically grow a Liberty tolerant canola variety. So this gives you the 2,4-D Roundup option to come in there and take that out, as well as any of the other weeds that you'd have in the field at that time.
Okay, so then if that's kind of some of the lessons you've learned over the last few years, I think one of the things from the past year, Grace, is weather cannot always go as well. Like you talk about, what in a perfect world, here's what we're going to do. It wasn't necessarily the perfect world the past year. Can you talk a little bit about what the growing season was like in your territory and where some of those issues kind of arose that we obviously just have to be mindful as growers for the next few years?
So by the time that soybeans and corn, for that matter, they got planted into pretty great conditions in 2023. Then we had about a month to maybe a month and plus of zero rain. So not only did that mean that herbicides weren't getting that activating rainfall, it also meant the crop was under a tremendous amount of stress. So even going in with just a simple glyphosate pass could potentially have seen a crop response or something, because that crop was so under stress that any additional stress on top was causing some maybe leaf speckling. So people were hesitant to go across their field. Then the rain hit, which was great. Crop really rallied. We had pretty awesome yields, but that meant the weeds started growing. So we needed to get in and control the weeds ASAP, but we also needed to get across the field. And when the rain kept coming, it kept coming and kept coming. So there were very few spray day opportunities where the field was fit to get across, and there was no rain in the forecast. So that's where, with the Enlist system, getting across to help support those residuals that maybe didn't get that activating rainfall this year, you had a very narrow window, and when you did, you wanted to be able to go across the field with an on-label application. Maybe your weeds got a little bit bigger. The Enlist system would maybe give you that advantage of adding in some Liberty in with your Enlist one to kind of help give you that extra knockdown on top of the systemic activity of the 2,4-D choline. But it really, in general, we were able to navigate it quite well, considering it was somewhat of a challenging weed control year.
So I think one thing that I could add to that is, if you have a good pre-emerge down up front and you've got a tight window for weed control, if you're out scouting fields, maybe this field has some weeds in it, so you can come in that field with the Enlist system, and then maybe another field is clean still, so it gives you that flexibility of you put a pre-emerge on both of those, that maybe you can skip this field and just concentrate on the ones you need to.
Because it always feels like a challenge in the spring that there's just everything needs to be sprayed. Everything, you're cleaning up, planters. If anybody's, working at hay or anything, that's all, like there's just so much going on. You tend to default, or by you, I mean me, tend to default to what's the easiest thing, right? This is in, I'll just go do this because this is next on my list. Probably the thing that I really should be doing more is that scouting side, to take advantage of and prioritize the stuff that probably needs it most.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Keep a little money in your pocket too.
How so?
Well, if you don't have to put a second application on one of your fields, maybe it's 20% of your fields, that's, you're not running over the field with equipment, so you don't have the fuel cost plus your savings on herbicide. So, and maybe you don't save that money, and maybe it just gets reallocated.
Because if I'm thinking through like some of those ones, it is very much habit that you say, okay, I'm just going to go out and I'm just going to spray this amount on this field, period, because that's what I did all the time before that. Grace, in terms of scouting, how can I do a better job of managing that and prioritizing, just where I'm going?
I would say if you do have an understanding of the weed spectrum that you're navigating and the soil types that you're on, so if you do know fields that you do struggle with glyphosate-resistant weeds, I think it is critical, especially for me to speak to my bias of water hemp. You need to be able to control that weed when it's small, and that weed can grow 1 inch to 1.5 inches a day. So those fields, I would say, are the ones that you're going to be prioritizing. Sometimes fields that are on lighter soil may have some slight bigger flushes that will come through with a little bit of rainfall. So I would say that would be a factor. Next, I would say is just as fields get later, you might have assumed that you got that activating rain, your field stayed clean. Maybe you didn't need that second pass of glyphosate, but you're going in for your fungicide timing. So you're going to want to be looking for those flowers. R2 is a great place to start, which is full flower for a fungicide timing. Make sure you're looking for weeds at that point. And with the Enlist system, you can put in Enlist 1 plus glyphosate in with your fungicide pass, and you can get 2 birds stoned at once.
Then in terms of, when you talk about that, when I'm going in and I'm mixing these types of things, is there anything in terms of, and you also mentioned, adding Liberty to this, and there's just a lot of combinations on the go at once. And I think that also, it can get tricky, and I can be in a rush, and I just want to get things done as quickly as possible and dump it in and go. What's some of the best processes, or what's some of the best advice in terms of ensuring that when I am going to go and mix these products for the right acre, that I'm not going to mess up the tank, or I'm actually going to get the most out of those herbicides?
So first thing I would just say is water is going to be your friend when it comes to tank mixing. So if we're talking about tank mixing with Enlist herbicides, we always recommend to start with ideally half full of water, but making sure that if you between mixing, and we're going to want to follow the WHAM legs acronym, so understanding what kind of formulations that you're working with, and putting them in sequential order, and making sure that they are each agitated before adding the next ingredient in. If we're getting into tank mixing, you're going to get into some hiccups if you decide to take 2 jugs in each hand and dump them in at once.
But that's faster, Grace.
It's cleaning. Have you ever cleaned out cleaned out a sprayer? Because it's not super fast. I don't have any tips as a fast way to clean out a sprayer.
It could be a lot slower too.
So sequential mixing is what I will say. It might take you an extra 10 minutes at the sprayer, but it can avoid hours of clean out when you could be out spraying. So I would say know your formulations, use WHAM legs, lots of water, big things.
Then in terms of, you talk about, all these mixes that we can be doing, and I think that probably fits partly into the resistance management question. How do we properly use the products that we have available today, because new ones aren't coming out, at any great speed. In fact, the last new active ingredient that came out was how many years ago? Here's a quiz.
1984.
1984. That was not yesterday. And we've obviously got a lot of resistant weeds. So, Holly, in terms of resistant management, where does not only the Enlist system fit with a grower, but what does a grower's mindset need to be to ensure that we do actually manage the resistance we have now, not expand more, and not get it where we don't have products to control weeds?
So I think it's the standard, I feel like the standard agronomy answer, multiple modes of action, right? Just making sure that you're not spraying the same mode of action, same chemical over and over and over again. That's how we developed the Roundup resistant problem that we have. So making sure that you're keeping track, not just in one crop. So, the Enlist system gives you the Roundup, 2,4-D, and Liberty options. So 3 modes of action, you can use 2 in there, but that's soybeans. But then also thinking about your corn rotation, if you've got wheat in the rotation, making sure that you're using different modes of action in each crop. And we've done some programs with people where you get up to 9 different modes of action over 3 years. Roundup would be the continual one between there, but you've added in, maybe 1 or 2 different ones every crop. So you can really add up your modes of action pretty quick if you're thinking about it and have a plan in place.
And then, but not only modes of action, Grace, you talked about water hemp, and the fact that it's growing so fast and going to be hard to control. Part of that must also include, the age-old, you talked about scouting, that I need to get out and I need to actually scout the field. But that probably is it too, to make sure that what we think is being controlled is actually being controlled.
Yes, and when it comes with water hemp, Water hemp is definitely a doozy. I live in Elgin County. There's 5-way resistant water hemp already. So on top of, well, ensuring that instead of just multiple modes of action, you're using multiple modes of effective action.
Yes.
But the way that water hemp is why it's become such a prolific weed and been so problematic is because it's a dioecious weed, which means it has a male and a female, and they create a new plant, which means a lot of genetic diversity. So, which means it's able to develop resistance very, very quickly. So for some growers who might think, oh, I'm gonna adopt the Enlist weed control system, I'm gonna do 2 or 3 passes and that's gonna wipe out all my weeds. Like, that is likely going to have us break the system before we're able to fully adopt it. So we need to stick to the basics. Let's understand what weed spectrum you have so that you're able to develop your plan outside of water hemp, just knowing if you need some metribuzin, if you need any other different active ingredients to help keep your fields clean. Be prepared to have 2 passes in your soybean herbicide system, and overall we'll be able to offset that day where we run into more resistance in Ontario.
So I think, Holly, in terms of, when we think about, Grace talked about the fact that, there are growers there that have kind of gone all Enlist, over the last few years in her region. There's still a lot of areas that have not, and lots of growers that there's still very much a newness to what the E3 program is. Give me an idea in terms of, for those that just need a little bit more confidence to know that, no, this is the right bean for the right acre. How do we get them there?
Sure. So I think we just need to think about, these are Pioneer soybeans. They come out of our Pioneer breeding program, the same program that bred A series and Roundup Readies before that. We now have a new Z series of beans. Part of that Z series is a level of agronomic performance that we expect. And there's minimum scores for things like white mold, and they all come with mostly come with SCM protection. And in the future, will be 100% pretty much SCN. So those agronomic traits that you need to grow in your fields linked to the yield performance that we at Pioneer have always had, we expect it. So just knowing that confidence that these are Pioneer soybeans, they just have a different herbicide technology kind of plopped in there that makes that part of your management system better.
And that does it for this episode of the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. If you haven't checked it out already, we actually have a pretty full library now of all sorts of episodes, whether that be on financial management, more agronomy advice, or even things like policy and business planning. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts, whether that be Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or any of the others, or you can also find us on YouTube at the Corteva Canada channel. And don't forget, if you ever need more information or advice, you can always ask your local Pioneer rep or visit pioneer.com/Canada.